My name is Margaret Delaney, and I turned 68 today. I said it out loud this morning to the plants on my windowsill, hoping the sound of my own voice would soften the sting that had already begun to tighten in my chest. I made myself a vanilla sponge cake, just like the ones I used to bake when Claire and Nathan were children, soft and airy, with whipped cream and strawberries layered between. The smell of it took me back to birthdays spent on picnic blankets in the park, the three of us laughing while the wind played with paper plates. Back when they still called me Mum and not Margaret in stiff emails signed, "Sent from my iPhone." I lit one candle, just one, and whispered a wish that felt foolish even as it left my mouth. I wished they would remember, that one of them would call, or even send a simple message with a heart emoji, anything to prove that I still had a place in their world. I sat alone at my kitchen table in my little brick home outside Chicago, the late winter light slanting across the linoleum and onto the empty chair across from me. It was quiet, except for the soft hum of the fridge and the creak of the radiator. I took a photo of the cake, not to post but to remember that I had once made something beautiful today. Later, while washing up, I opened my phone out of habit and saw it the photo Claire had posted. Her legs in the sand, a cocktail in hand, captioned with palm trees and the word, bliss. Nathan commented, "Best trip ever," beneath it. My hands stilled in the sudsy water. No mention of me. No text. No call. Not even a belated afterthought. The silence stretched across the hours like a weighted blanket, pressing into my ribs, reminding me with every breath that I had once been the center of their world and now existed somewhere at its frayed edge. I didn't cry. Not yet. I put the rest of the cake into a Tupperware container and slid it into the fridge, knowing full well it would sit there until I tossed it. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching as the streetlights flickered on and the world outside continued without noticing. I thought about all the birthdays I had thrown for them. Pirate cakes and treasure hunts, sleepovers with handmade invitations, dinosaur balloons and cardboard crowns. I thought about how they used to wake me up with sloppy kisses and drawings made from crayons and construction paper. Now, the only thing I had received was silence, dressed in sunshine and hashtags. And still, I folded my hands gently in my lap, because I was raised to have grace, and grace is not contingent on being remembered. But I remembered, and that, I knew, would shape everything that came next. They used to call me Mum, like it meant something holy, like I was their harbour in a storm, a name carried on tired lips when fever broke or nightmares clawed through the walls of sleep. But somewhere along the way, between graduations and new jobs, marriages and mortgages, the word softened, then vanished. It started subtly, like a draft under a door. An email from Claire that opened with, "Hi Margaret," as if we had only just been introduced at a networking brunch. Nathan followed, not long after, with curt texts beginning with my name and ending with periods, like I was a secretary being given orders. I would stare at the screen, rereading the salutation over and over, as if the sheer repetition might make the sting dull. It never did. Our phone calls had once stretched into the night, Claire updating me on her travel plans, Nathan sharing the silly things his son had said at breakfast. Then they shortened. Became bulletins. "We're fine. Work is hectic. Can't talk long." Until finally, there was no call at all. I was always the one dialing. Always the one leaving voicemails that were never returned, my voice echoing into an indifferent digital void. I used to be their compass. I remember wiping down Nathan's forehead when the flu had him shivering through 3 layers of sweat-drenched sheets, the smell of Vicks clinging to my skin for days. I remember holding Claire's hand after her first heartbreak, when she thought the world had ended at 19 and cried into my lap until her eyes went raw. I made late-night drives with a thermos of soup when they were broke and broken, and I filled grocery bags with food when their cupboards were bare. I helped with their resumes. I watched their children. I listened without judgment. I loved without conditions. Now, I am met with rolled eyes when I offer advice. I am told I am interfering when I ask how they are really doing. I am given side glances and polite smiles, like a guest who overstays her welcome. I cannot trace the moment it shifted, but I feel its weight like a stone in my chest. I walk through this house, the same one I saved to buy so they would always have a safe place to land, and all I hear is silence. No footsteps racing down the stairs, no slamming doors, no laughter echoing off the walls. Just me, the woman they used to call Mum. Now, I am Margaret. Margaret, who gets forwarded invitations instead of calls. Margaret, who receives updates through social media rather than memories shared in real time. Margaret, who has become a footnote in the lives she once centered. And as much as it breaks something soft and maternal in me, it also builds something else in its place. Something cold and clear. I am no longer confused. I am no longer waiting. I am learning the power of names, and how quietly people rewrite your story when you are not looking. The first time I wrote my will, I used a mechanical pencil and sat at the dining table with my reading glasses slipping down my nose and my heart swelling with a quiet sort of pride. It was a cold evening in 2006, and the smell of my roast lamb still lingered in the air. Claire had just gotten her first promotion. Nathan had finally proposed to Anna, and I remember thinking that no matter what came next, they would be taken care of. Every line I wrote felt like a promise. The house would go to Claire because she always said it reminded her of safety. My savings would be split evenly between them, and the jewelry I wore only on holidays would be given to Anna and later, maybe to little Ava when she was old enough to appreciate the weight of heirlooms. I even specified which books to pass on, which photos to keep in frames, which recipe cards to preserve. Every item had a memory attached. Every clause written in that will carried the weight of devotion measured in meals cooked, knees bandaged, and nights spent awake worrying about their futures. But I reread it now with disbelief, sitting at the same table, though the roast lamb has long since been replaced by store-brand soup and silence. The handwriting feels foreign. Who was that woman who believed she owed everything to her children? Who was that mother who thought her love would be remembered as something precious rather than as something expected? The last time I saw Nathan, he scrolled through his phone the entire time we were together, only looking up to ask if I had any of that wine he liked. Claire stopped bringing Ava around altogether, saying the drive was too far and weekends were busy. They speak to me like they're checking off a list, like remembering me as a task rather than a desire. I wonder now if they ever saw me as anything other than someone who could be relied on to give, to provide, to absorb their worries like a sponge and return only softness. I have the will in front of me, its edges worn from years in the drawer, and for the first time in a long while, I see it not as a gift, but as a reflection of someone who didn't know she was being taken for granted. I trace my name and theirs, erasing line by line, with a firmness I didn't know I still possessed. It feels right. It feels necessary. I have loved deeply, but I am learning that love, when not returned, becomes something hollow. This time, I will write a different will. I will use ink, and every word will be chosen not from guilt, but from clarity. They wrote me out of their lives, while smiling to my face. Now it is my turn to write, and I will not use a pencil again. The house was quiet, in the way that only a lived-in home can be, after its stories stopped being told aloud. Every clock still ticked, the kettle still whistled, The floors still creaked in protest of age. But the laughter that once danced down the hallway had long since settled into silence. I sat across from Eleanor Reese at my kitchen table, a woman I hadn't truly caught up with in nearly a decade, though our Christmas cards had never skipped a year. She looked just the same, only with more silver in her hair and more weight in her gaze. She laid out her legal pad like a priest might lay out a prayer book, neat and reverent. We didn't start with law. We started with tea. Earl Grey for her, chamomile for me. We talked about her grandchildren, her new garden beds, the leak in my upstairs bath. It was only when she uncapped her pen that my throat tightened, as if putting this to paper would finally make real what had only existed in heartbreak until now. I handed her the old will. She read it silently, eyes moving quickly, her pen already circling and underlining in practiced rhythm. When she looked up, her face was neither judgmental nor surprised. She simply said, "You're not cutting them out. You're just correcting the record." That sentence clung to me, soft and liberating. I wasn't acting out of bitterness. I was acting out of truth. I told her how Nathan once asked if he could borrow £5,000 for a business idea and never paid it back. I told her how Claire sent birthday flowers one year, with my name spelled wrong. I told her how they stopped calling me Mum and started calling me Margaret in emails, how their voices dulled when I offered advice, how my very presence became something to endure instead of embrace. Eleanor didn't ask why I had waited so long. She knew. Women like us were raised to fold ourselves around others, to be dependable and undemanding, to age quietly and exit gracefully. But I was tired of whispering in my own home. I was tired of rewarding silence with legacy. So we began again. We listed charities I cared about. We discussed contingencies. We outlined what would happen to the house, the garden, the things I had built and loved. We even laughed once or twice, a dry sort of laughter, the kind that comes when you realize how long you've held your breath. When she packed up her notes, I offered her a slice of lemon drizzle cake I had baked that morning. She took two. I walked her to the door and felt lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had heard me and approved. The house was still quiet after she left, but it no longer felt like it was mourning. It felt like it was listening. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt heard. The pen felt heavier in my hand than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Eleanor slid the new draft across the table, her fingers tapping lightly on the place I needed to sign. I stared at it for a long while, the words on the page clearer than they had ever been, each line a quiet declaration of self-respect. This was not revenge. This was restoration. The clause sat there, in elegant legal prose, simple and devastatingly fair. Any inheritance would be contingent upon ongoing, demonstrable care, contact, and presence. Not the kind that showed up after death when the flowers came too late and the tears came too easily, but the kind that existed when it was inconvenient, when no one else was watching, when it truly mattered. Eleanor had helped me word it carefully, without venom. There would be no forced affection, no guilt-laced obligations. Just an honest expectation. They would have to call. They would have to visit. They would have to treat me like more than a burden kept alive out of reluctant duty. And if they couldn't do that, then the inheritance would pass quietly and completely to the Windmere Community Arts Centre, the very place that had saved me when grief had turned my world upside down. After Robert died, I had wandered into their pottery class just to get out of the house. I had moulded bowls with trembling hands, cried into clay, laughed when I hadn't meant to. They had given me space to feel human again. They never asked for anything in return. I remembered painting a small teacup with a crooked daffodil and thinking how kind it was to be allowed to create something just for the sake of creating. That little cup still sat in my kitchen, chipped and faded, but never thrown out. That place had seen me at my lowest and never flinched. That was loyalty. That was family. I signed my name with a steady hand, feeling a strange peace settle into my bones. Eleanor smiled but didn't speak. She didn't need to. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper said everything. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. The garden beyond still wintered over but beginning to hint at spring. I imagined Claire and Nathan's faces when the time came, the confusion, the protest, the sudden, frantic rewrites of history. Let them read it in my voice. Let them hear the silence they once gave me, echoing back in legal ink. Let them understand that love is not an entitlement. It is a practice, a presence, a choice. And I would no longer reward absence with generosity. When Eleanor tucked the papers into her briefcase, she kissed my cheek gently and told me she was proud of me. I smiled, not because I needed her pride, but because for once, I felt proud of myself. The ground was slick with ice, a glassy sheen over the pavement that caught my foot before I could even register the danger. And the next thing I knew, I was staring at the sky with pain blooming through my hip like fire through dry leaves. I remember thinking, as they loaded me into the ambulance, that Claire would be furious about the disruption. That thought shouldn't have come first, but it did. At the hospital, they asked for my emergency contact, and I gave them Claire's name, half out of habit, half out of some worn thread of hope I hadn't yet severed. They said they called her twice. Left voicemails. Nothing. I lay there for hours in that sterile room, the clock ticking loud and lonely, until a nurse with kind eyes and a braid down her back came in and called me love, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her name was June. She wasn't young, probably in her 50s, with laugh lines that said more about her than any resume ever could. She helped me sit up, wrapped a warm blanket around my shoulders, and brought me a bowl of soup so rich and fragrant it made my throat tighten. "No one should heal on an empty stomach," she said, her voice like chamomile tea, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for far too long. She checked on me more than she needed to, asked about my garden, listened when I spoke about books and Robert and the silly clay cup I had made. She didn't pity me. She just saw me. On the second day, she brought in a cardigan someone had donated to the charity she volunteered for, a soft lavender thing that smelled faintly of rosemary. "Yours now," she said with a shrug, and I had to turn my head so she wouldn't see the tears slip out. When the discharge papers came, Claire still hadn't responded. Not even a text. I took a pen and crossed her name off the contact list before I left. That night, when I got home, I brewed tea and sat with the amended will, still tucked in its manila folder beside the fruit bowl. I added a note to Eleanor's draft, requesting a small donation be made annually to June's charity. Not out of obligation, out of recognition. There are people who see you in your weakest hour and choose kindness without ceremony. And sometimes those people are strangers with soup in their hands and light in their voices. Claire had become the kind of daughter who left voicemails unheard. June, in 3 days, had become the kind of woman who made the world feel less cold. It was not about replacing anyone. It was about honoring what love actually looked like. And love, I had come to understand, often wore scrubs and knew how to stir soup with purpose. I had spent the better part of the week preparing for the little spring lunch, not because I expected applause or grand gestures, but because there was something sacred in setting a table with care and watching people eat food that had been seasoned with memory. I sent Claire and Nathan handwritten invitations on thick paper with embossed flowers, something I knew they would find outdated, but I chose them anyway because I still believed in touches that took time. Their response came 2 days later via email. Not even a call. Can't make it busy. Hope it goes well. No warmth, no curiosity. Just a dismissal wrapped in efficiency. I reread the message more times than I care to admit, letting its coldness settle into my bones like late frost. Still, the day of the lunch arrived with sun breaking through the branches and a breeze that smelled faintly of lilac and trimmed grass. I wore my yellow dress, the one Robert always said made me look like sunlight, and I set the table under the wisteria vines that had finally bloomed after such a stubborn winter. My friends came: Delia with her sharp wit and crooked sunglasses, Marjorie with her endless stories, and Mr. Howard from 2 houses down who always brought wine no one asked for. We ate pastelitos and cucumber sandwiches, drank chilled lemonade with floating mint leaves, and laughed until our cheeks ached. The air was light, our wrinkles deepened with joy, and I never once had to filter what I said to be digestible. A young neighbour, Melissa, wandered over with her camera and asked if she could film the spread for her food blog. I said yes, thinking nothing of it. She captured the plates, the laughter, the way sunlight danced through glass pitchers. I saw her later that night crouched over her laptop on her porch, editing with a smile. I thought about Claire and Nathan, somewhere probably scrolling through perfectly curated posts, oblivious to the imperfect beauty they had missed. I thought about the times I used to pack their lunches with notes tucked inside, words like "you are loved," written in cursive they could barely read. Now my name existed in their world only as a calendar event to skip. But here, in this small pocket of joy, I was not skipped. I was seen. I was tasted. I was loved. The next morning, Melissa texted to say the clip had already racked up thousands of views and dozens of comments asking for my pastelito recipe. I smiled and went to water the garden, thinking maybe love doesn't always come in the shape of children you bore. Sometimes it blooms in neighbours with cameras, friends with full bellies, and the simple act of feeding people who know how to say thank you without being reminded. Claire called on a Monday afternoon, her voice tight with urgency, like someone balancing a tray of glasses that could shatter with the slightest tilt. "Mum," she said, the word foreign in her mouth now, more like a placeholder than an endearment. "I need you to sign something for me. It's just a simple document, financial power of attorney. For emergencies, you know." I sat in my sunroom, tea cooling beside me, the scent of chamomile mingling with the smell of fresh potting soil. I listened without interrupting, nodding though she couldn't see it, watching a bee hover near the window screen. "Of course," I said gently, like I hadn't been waiting for this moment for months. She emailed it over that evening, a long, bland document filled with dry language and legal loopholes dressed up as care. I read every word twice, then printed it out and circled 3 lines that, if signed blindly, would have handed her access to everything I still owned. My savings, my home, the tiny pension Robert had worked 3 decades for. There was a time I would have done it without question, but that time was buried with the photo albums she never asks about anymore. I rang Eleanor that night. She came over with her usual folders and a raised eyebrow. We drank coffee over my kitchen table and drafted a counter clause that revoked any previous authority Claire had held, nullified her as an agent entirely, and reassigned my power of attorney to Eleanor herself. I had trusted Claire with my life once. Now I trusted a woman who actually showed up when I called. When Claire returned days later, rushed and distracted in her high-heeled clatter and overpriced perfume, I offered her coffee and a pen. She smiled at me for the first time in what felt like years. "Thanks, Mum. Knew I could count on you," she said, flipping to the signature page without reading. I watched her sign and imagined her shock unraveling when she'd later discover that the very paper she thought would control me had freed me entirely. She left just as quickly, tossing a kiss toward the air behind her. I folded the document, tucked it into the drawer with the good scissors, and made myself a slice of apple tart. Sweet and sharp, just how I liked it. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, not because I had gotten revenge, but because I had reclaimed something far more sacred. My boundaries, my dignity, my future. The next morning, I walked past the old family portrait in the hall, the one where Claire leaned into me, a child full of need and trust. I touched the frame gently, not out of grief, but out of quiet release. She would never again use my love as leverage. She had signed the paper, but I had written the terms. Nathan arrived on a Thursday, unannounced, holding a grocery store bouquet that still had the price tag dangling from the plastic wrap. The lilies were wilted at the edges, as if they'd already been rejected once before being handed to me like a peace offering no one believed in. I opened the door without surprise, stepping aside with a soft, "Come in, love," as if I hadn't already anticipated his visit, the moment Claire realized the will no longer belonged to her. He shuffled into the living room, glancing around like it had been years instead of months, like the familiar furniture and the faint scent of cinnamon might accuse him if he looked them in the eye. "I've been meaning to come by," he said, clearing his throat like a nervous schoolboy, though the stubble on his chin and the tiredness in his shoulders betrayed the man he had become grown, but somehow still evasive. I took the flowers and placed them gently in a vase, filling it with water, while he rambled about work being overwhelming, about how things had just gotten away from him lately. I brewed tea while he talked, jasmine with a hint of lemon, the kind he used to love when he was small and feverish and curled beside me on the couch. He didn't ask how I had been. He didn't mention my birthday or the hospital stay or the garden lunch. He declined with a half-hearted excuse. Instead, he circled the conversation like a vulture, waiting to see if the meal was ready to give. "Claire mentioned you've been updating some things," he said finally, watching me too closely over the rim of his cup. "Just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay." I smiled and nodded, the way you do when someone's performance is more for themselves than for you. I let him pour his concern like lukewarm syrup over a bowl of dust. He didn't know the details, only that Claire had mentioned something about clauses and conditions, and the possibility that not everything was going to pass to them unchallenged. He was fishing, softly, carefully, hoping charm might reveal what silence had concealed. I let him lie. I let him believe I was touched by the gesture, by the sudden drop-in visit, by the flowers that were already starting to brown. When he left, I walked him to the door and kissed his cheek, the way mothers are supposed to. "Thank you for coming," I said, like it meant something. He smiled, relieved, thinking the act had worked. But as I closed the door behind him and looked at the flowers slumped in their vase, I felt no ache, just clarity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed. I was simply done pretending that breadcrumbs counted as love. It was Eleanor who called. Her voice, steady as always. The kind of calm that follows through thunderstorms and courtroom chaos alike. "They've missed the window again, Margaret," she said, gently but without hesitation, like a surgeon about to cut. I had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud still settled into my bones like a long exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding. 6 months. Not a birthday card, not a call, not even a forwarded email with a tired, "thought you might like this," scribbled above a link. Nothing. Just silence. Heavy and consistent. The kind that tells you more than words ever could. Eleanor didn't ask if I was sure. We had written the clause carefully, each line a quiet reckoning. Inheritance contingent upon continued and meaningful contact. It read, plain as Sunday morning truth. It wasn't vengeance. It was accounting. A ledger finally balanced. She filed the necessary documents, and by Monday, Certified letters had been sent to both Claire and Nathan, their names at the top, followed by the revised terms of my estate. The house, the savings, the silver set wrapped in velvet I had saved for Claire's daughter one day. All of it was no longer theirs by assumption. Instead, it had been reallocated. The Community Arts Centre would expand its senior program with part of it. June's clinic would get another wing for palliative care. The rest would sit in trust for future recipients of a scholarship I had named after my late husband, David, who had once told me that family was not defined by blood but by who stayed when things got quiet. The outcry began before the ink dried. Claire called 5 times in one morning, each voicemail rising in pitch, from confusion to disbelief to righteous fury. Nathan emailed a list of grievances masked as questions. Was this a mistake? Were you pressured? Is someone taking advantage of you? I didn't answer. I didn't owe them a defense. The clause was the defense. The truth carved into legal stone, not as punishment, but as proof. Proof that love, when neglected, doesn't stay bound by old promises. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with a cup of tea and watched the wind tug gently at the curtains. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't even smug. I was relieved. I had made something clear in a language they understood only when it affected their inheritance. Love, like trust, had conditions. Not transactional ones, but human ones. Show up, call, care. And if not, then do not expect a future built on memories you abandoned. Eleanor texted a single word after the last form was submitted. Done. I stared at it for a long time, then smiled. Not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped waiting to be remembered. They called me selfish. Claire's voice was the sharpest, as if each syllable had been honed behind gritted teeth before it ever touched the air. You're our mother. You owe us, she said, and the word owe clung to the room like smoke, sour and stubborn. Nathan tried to soften the blow, but it was no different, only cloaked in that placating tone he uses when he wants something. They both stood in my living room like strangers in their childhood home, eyes scanning for something familiar they might still claim. You're being dramatic, Claire continued. You've turned this into a test. I listened, not because I was looking for understanding, but because I had learned that silence sometimes holds more power than shouting. I let them speak. I let them unravel every accusation they had tucked away in the corners of their curated adulthood. And when they paused, expecting either an apology or an explosion, I gave them neither. Instead, I stood up slowly, hands wrapped around the mug I had been holding for warmth rather than caffeine, and I said, "Being your mother is what I gave you. You don't get to define what I get in return." I said it softly, like a hymn, like something sacred I had finally dared to say aloud. The words didn't tremble. They didn't rise. They simply landed, solid and undeniable. Claire blinked like she had just been slapped. Nathan looked away. I walked past them and opened the window, letting fresh air in, because the room had grown thick with old expectations and unspoken debts. I didn't ask them to understand. I didn't need them to. The truth is, motherhood is a gift given freely, but it is not a contract of servitude. It is not a vow of perpetual tolerance. I raised them through fevered nights, heartbreaks, and scraped knees. I sacrificed, celebrated, endured. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as a person and started treating me like a default setting, something static they could ignore until it inconvenienced them. The clause, the will, the boundaries, they were not about revenge. They were about dignity. Mine. And when I reminded them of it, they called it cruelty. But I have learned that those who are used to your silence will always call your truth unkind. So I stood at the window, breathed in the late autumn air, and whispered to no one in particular. Let them call me what they want. I know what I am. Not selfish. Not dramatic. Just no longer invisible. Just no longer apologizing for needing what I've always given. Real love. Real presence. And respect that doesn't expire once the parenting is done. I didn't expect it to spread. I certainly didn't expect a young journalist named Rosa Kim to show up at my door with a notebook, a voice recorder, and eyes that looked like they still believed stories could change something. She had read a snippet buried deep in the community legal bulletin about an elderly woman who rewrote her will to include conditions of care and presence and decided it wasn't just a legal oddity. It was a mirror held up to a society that asks everything of mothers and offers so little once they've served their purpose. I made her tea, of course, and we sat at the kitchen table that had once held birthday cakes, school permission slips, and 100 quiet sacrifices. She asked thoughtful questions. She didn't prod or twist. She just listened, and when I finished explaining the clause and the reasons behind it, she sat back in her chair and said, "You know, you're going to help more people than you realize." I smiled politely, thinking the story might land in the back of some Sunday column, maybe spark a small ripple. But a week later, my face was on the homepage of her paper's digital edition beneath the headline, "They stopped calling her mum, so she called her lawyer." I read it once. Then I read it again. It was kind. It was honest. And it was seen. The letters began arriving a few days later. Emails from other mothers, grandmothers, even a few fathers, telling me that they had felt erased too. One woman wrote, "You gave me courage to do the same," and I read that line over breakfast like a prayer. Another said, "I thought I was just being bitter. Turns out, I was just done being taken for granted." My hands shook as I folded some of them neatly into a shoebox I had once used to store Nathan's baby shoes. I never answered all of them, but I read every single word. I thought of how lonely my birthday had been, of that cake I baked for myself, of the silence that used to feel like failure. Now, the silence feels different. It feels like space I filled with my own voice instead of waiting for someone else's. Rosa wrote a follow-up. She asked if I wanted to be interviewed on a radio program. I declined. I told her I'd already said what I needed to say, and the people who needed to hear it had heard it. I walk differently now. Straighter, slower, not out of frailty, but intention. The world didn't change overnight, but a few people did, including me. I don't think of it as revenge. I think of it as a recipe for reclamation. And apparently, I'm not the only one hungry for it. The notary arrived just before noon. A quiet woman named Lydia, with silver-rimmed glasses and a warm smile that reminded me of the school librarian I adored as a child. I had set the garden table myself that morning, the same one I once wept beside under the wisteria's heavy blooms, wondering how a mother could feel so unseen. This time, the table was dressed in a white lace cloth, fresh flowers from the yard, and little crystal glasses I hadn't brought out since Edward's retirement party. Around me sat the people who had filled the hollow spaces my children left behind. June, the nurse who once called me love while I was shivering and bruised in a hospital bed. Rosa, the young journalist whose words cracked open something far wider than either of us expected. Eleanor, my dearest friend, who had not only drawn up every clause and codicil, but sat with me through the ache of each one. My neighbour Patrick, who brought over soup when my hip gave out last winter. And his husband Lee, who strung fairy lights around the trellis, like we were preparing for a wedding instead of a will signing. And there was laughter, soft and genuine, not the strained kind I used to hear from Claire when she checked her phone mid-visit. As I signed each page, my hand steady and my spine straighter than it had been in years, I felt something inside me settle, like a picture finally hung in its proper frame. Lydia handed me the final document, embossed and notarized, and said, "It's done." But what she meant was, "It's yours." I looked around and raised my glass. The elderflower wine was light, sweet, and a bit floral, like memory softened with time. "To chosen family," I said. "To people who show up without being asked." They clinked glasses with me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an afterthought or a lesson to be learned too late. I felt like a woman who had rewritten her ending with grace and a steady hand. The wisteria above us swayed gently in the breeze, the same branches that once bore witness to my grief, now holding witness to my peace. I could almost hear Edward's voice in my ear, proud and amused, saying, "You always did know how to host a proper gathering." I smiled into my glass. This wasn't a punishment. It was a proclamation. I had offered love. I had endured its absence. And now I had honored my own presence. The garden never looked more beautiful, not because of what was growing, but because of who was seated there. My signature on those papers wasn't just ink. It was a boundary drawn in gold, and I was finally on the right side of it. Claire and Nathan didn't expect to receive anything from me. That much was clear, by the way. The courier later told Eleanor they opened their envelopes with a mix of suspicion and confusion, as if kindness had become foreign to them, as if memory itself were something owed rather than gifted. Inside each envelope, I had placed a black and white photo, one of those faded Polaroids that had lived for decades, tucked behind the sugar jar in my kitchen. Claire's showed her as a toddler, face smeared with chocolate frosting from the cake. I stayed up until 2 a.m. to make, after her kindergarten teacher said she loved giraffes. Nathan's was him at 10, missing a front tooth, holding a plate of Arrows con pollo he'd declared the best thing in the universe the night I cooked it during a storm that left us without power. Along with each photograph was a recipe card written in my own looping script, the same handwriting they used to mimic in birthday cards with crayons, back when they still believed I hung the moon. The final piece in each letter was a note, no longer than a few lines, written on cream stationery I had saved for special occasions. It read, "I waited for you to come home. I made your favorite. You never showed. I didn't scold or beg or explain. I didn't ask why they stopped calling me Mum or why they thought silence could stand in for presence. I simply left them the truth, plated in memory and garnished with the kind of love that expects nothing in return but still aches when neglected." I heard from Patrick, who had run into Claire at the market, that she cried right there in the produce aisle, clutching the recipe like it had burned her hand. Nathan, according to a former co-worker of his who now volunteers at the community centre, kept the letter folded in his wallet for weeks. Whether they ever replied didn't matter. The letters were never meant as an invitation back. They were a mirror, a quiet one, held up without judgment. I wanted them to remember not just who I had been, but who they were when they still believed love was worth showing up for. I had no illusions. They would come knocking with apologies or tears, though the part of me that once rocked them through fevers and night terrors always held a faint whisper of hope. Still, I had made peace with their absence. My home was full now, in ways they had chosen not to be part of. I sent those letters not as a goodbye, but as a final serving of the mother they left behind. They could ignore my calls, my birthdays, my pain, but they could never say they weren't loved. Not when the proof sat right there in their hands, stained with cocoa powder and memory. I never needed a grand farewell, only that the life I lived would echo in places where real warmth mattered. When my time came, it was quiet and kind, like the way sunlight filters through wisteria in late spring. I passed in my sleep, in my favorite chair by the window, wrapped in the same knit shawl I wore the day Nathan took his first steps. The neighbors found me, the ones who became family not through blood but by showing up, bowl in hand, story on their tongue, love in their bones. I had made arrangements long before, down to the music I wanted played, and the small note left in my recipe tin. Let there be bread. Let there be laughter. Let there be no fighting over my things. They honored that. I heard later how the memorial at the community center overflowed with people, not because I was famous, but because I had been faithful. They gathered under that same mural we painted during those long afternoons of healing, when bruised women learned to find beauty in color again. There was elderflower wine and a table of dishes I used to teach with, now made by others who once doubted they were good enough. Someone read the inscription aloud, the one Eleanor helped engrave into the plaque above the workshop door. In honor of the woman who taught us that love deserves presence. No titles, no Mrs., no Mum. Just Margaret. Just me. Whole, steady, and unrepentant about how I chose to write my ending. They said stories were shared that day, not just mine but their own. Because somehow my stubborn little rebellion gave others permission to take up space, to demand more than silence in return for devotion. I became a verb, they told me. Not just a name, but a way to be. When someone showed up with a casserole after a hard day, they called it a Margaret move. When someone redrew their will with dignity instead of guilt, they said, she's pulling a Margaret. I laughed at that from wherever I was, because it turns out you can become something larger than your bones if you live in truth long enough. I didn't leave behind a fortune, but I left something richer. A home that was no longer haunted by absence, a legal legacy that guarded my final years, and a kitchen that still smelled of warm bread and second chances. I died not waiting by the phone, not straining for their voices, not begging for scraps of attention. I died with my name intact, written in ink, remembered not for what I gave away without condition, but for what I finally demanded back. My story is now their recipe, and whether they taste bitterness or grace is up to them. I simply chose to be the author of my own final course, and it was seasoned, at last, with peace.